With Final Fantasy VII Rebirth having just been released on PC, I decided to go back and check it out. And one of my favorite things about this game is its bosses. The bosses in this game are so good and each one stands out. But which ones are the best? Today I'm going to rank each and every boss from Final Fantasy VII Rebirth from worst to best. And also a disclaimer, this will have some minor spoilers, so you have been warned. But without further ado, let's jump into the list. And dead last, we have Grasptropod. Honestly, I forgot about this boss until playing through the game again. This boss looks cool, but it's nothing special. It's also pretty easy as well if you exploit his weakness, which is lightning. And I'm not the biggest fan of how this boss fight abducts your characters, eventually leaving it up to Cloud. That's kinda rude of him. I will say though, the beach setting is nice and getting to fight this thing in your swimsuit was pretty cool, but overall it's just a pretty basic fight and pretty forgettable too. Next up we have the Custom Valkyrie. This is a returning boss from Remake, and here it's pretty much the same except a little less epic. Instead of fighting it while climbing up the collapsed Sector 7 plate, we just fight it in a tiny arena on our way through Mount Coral. While I prefer the remake version of this fight, the fight is still pretty fun. Plus, he can be a bit tougher. It definitely isn't as easy as Grasptropod. Gosh, that name is so hard to say. What carries this boss for me isn't the fight itself, but the music. It's one of my favorite themes in Remake, and I'm glad they brought it back. Plus, it's a bit different now as well. Overall, it's a decent boss, it's just one we've seen before. In 25th place, we have the Gigatrice. This thing is really cool looking. The design of this thing is probably my favorite part about this boss. The fight itself is okay, though I will say this boss was really tanky. I felt like it had the most HP out of all the bosses I had fought up to this point, which caused the fight to take quite a while. This boss doesn't have many attacks, and it also likes to fly around a lot, making Tifa kinda useless for some of the fight. For the most part, this fight was really boring. Use Yuffie and Barrett's ranged attacks until you bring it to the ground by staggering it. Do that a couple times so you deplete this chunky thing's health bar. I just wish this fight was a bit more fun because the boss itself was just so cool looking. Next up we have Mithril Golem. If you played this game on hard mode, you'll know just how tough this guy was, but on normal he's actually not that bad, and he's pretty fun. This boss has you using Red 13 and Barrett, which were two characters I didn't use a lot up to this point, but I actually had a good time. The boss design here is also pretty good, and I like the red eyes, it kinda gives it a creepy vibe. This boss also has quite a few attacks you can use. I like the one where he shoots the blue crystal beams out of his back. That move looks so cool here. Honestly, this is a great fight for this early in the game. Next we have Elena and Rude. You fight the two of these characters twice, but I'm going to put them as one because they are pretty much the same. Now I'm not the biggest fan of fights against humans, so a lot of those will probably be lower, and this is one for example. While I like the characters of Elena and Rude, I'm not a big fan of the fight. I feel like these fights can be a lot harder, but it may just be a user error. My least favorite thing about fights like these is when I go to use an ability and I get hit and lose my move I was about to use as well as my ATB. That could just be so annoying sometimes. One thing I do really like is the move where Rude can grab one of your characters and swing them into another character. Stuff like that is just super cool. But other than that, I just wasn't crazy about this fight. Next we have Rufus, and let me just say, if this was a ranking by difficulty, this guy would be number 1. This was the hardest fight in the game for me. You can't use physical attacks against him unless you want to be countered, so you'll want to use magic, but charging your ATB can take so long since attacking him is just useless. I really didn't like the boss fight itself, but it was cool fighting against Rufus in the Gold Saucer Coliseum. And some of his moves were cool as well, like when he dashes around the arena. If only this fight wasn't so brutal, I would have enjoyed this way more. The whole Coliseum section at this part was just so great. You also have the second half of this fight where Darkstar comes to help Rufus, and honestly I thought this part was a bit easier, but still pretty tough. I don't even think the fight against him in Remake was as bad as this one. Next up we have Elena and Song, and the only reason this is above the rest of the Turks fights is because of the music here. The music here is a banger. Honestly, this fight wouldn't have been as bad if you weren't forced to use the characters that you use here. You have to use Yuffie, Aerith, and Red 13, and other than Aerith, I didn't use the others that much, which made this fight a bit difficult. But there isn't much more I can say about this fight that I haven't already said about the other Turk fights. It's honestly just more of the same. In 20th place, we have the Midgard Stormer, or Midgard Zolom if you played the OG. I was a bit disappointed when this guy wasn't impaled by a tree like he was in the original, but the fight itself is pretty good, and it's pretty tough for one of the first bosses. He's got quite a bit of health, and his fire attacks are pretty strong. The setting is also pretty cool for this boss, being in the creepy swamp, and the music for this boss is pretty good too, but nothing that really stands out. Overall, the Midgard Stormer is a really good boss that only ranks this low because all the other great bosses in this game. In 19th place, we have the Specimen H1024. This boss is another one of Hojo's gross experiments that Scarlet sends to us during the Gogaga reactor section of the game. Just like Hojo's other experiments, this thing is just as gross, but also super cool looking. Especially when it's absorbing up Mako and it begins to glow, that just looks so awesome. This boss also puts up quite the fight too, and can be pretty hard if you aren't careful. But my favorite thing about this fight has to be the area you fight him in. You're in the heart of the Gongaga reactor with a big pool of Mako to the side of you, which actually probably helps this boss. This whole section was probably one of my favorite parts in Rebirth because I just like how different it was, and the boss was so good, as well as the boss afterwards, which we'll get to a bit later. Next up, we have the Diabolic Variant. This boss kinda reminds me of the previous Specimen boss. It's another one of Hojo's experiments, and while I don't think it's as cool looking, I do think the fight is a bit more fun, specifically because I like the party a bit more here. And something about this boss kinda reminds me of Sephiroth. I think it's the weird face. But nevertheless, this is a great fight, and also the music here is really great as well. Next, we have the Materia Guardian. What a great first boss fight this is. I'm not sure if I like it as much as the Guard Scorpion from Remake in terms of first fights, but the fight is just as cinematic. And there's always something happening to keep this fight interesting. Plus, you get to play as Sephiroth here. And I'm a little sad that this is the only time we get to play as Sephiroth because he is so fun. But I'm glad we got the great boss fight to use him against. This fight starts off pretty tough, and it also teaches us about a lot of the moves we can do, like using range attacks when the Materia Guardian is on the ceiling, and halfway through the fight we use our first synergy ability, and it just adds to the epicness of this boss fight. And just like the majority of bosses in this game, this fight also has a really cool design as well as the music. It's just a great boss fight to open up the game and get you excited for the rest of the bosses. Next up, we have Roach, and this is one of the few human fights that I actually enjoy. It's a 1v1 where Cloud and Roach only use their weapons and no motorcycles, and unlike Rufus, this fight is way more enjoyable. My favorite thing about this fight is watching Roach slowly losing himself and becoming like the hooded guys. It was a great conclusion to his character, and I like how Cloud knows as soon as he shows up because he can sense Sephiroth. I mostly like this fight for the story that you get here, but I'm also a fan of fighting him outside the Nibelheim mansion. I will say though, I wish we fought him at a different part in the game because we had so many bosses back to back at this part. But I won't let that drag this fight down, it's still a fun fight. In 15th place, we have the first fight against Roach. I prefer this one a bit more than his second fight. It really feels like a show, and it's also a great conclusion to my favorite chapter in this game, being the Junon chapter. The music is a big standout here for me. As soon as I hear it, I get so hyped and just ready to beat up Roach. The fight itself is pretty fun too. I love seeing Roach drive his motorcycle around the room, but I will admit this fight was pretty easy for me, but still fun. This fight is just entertaining all the way through. In 14th place, we have Dine, and this is another one-on-one fight, but this time you're using Barret, and I like how this fight is more of a shoot-off since both of the characters are using guns, plus you got cover to hide behind, which is pretty cool. This is also a pretty emotional fight because Barret is watching as his old friend is slowly losing his mind. And one thing about this fight I'm not so sure how to feel about is the second phase, where all the scraps around connect to Dine's weapon, kind of mutating him. Then he has the metal tentacles, which kind of make him look like Doc Ock from Spider-Man. These tentacles will shoot beams at you, and they are kind of tough to avoid sometimes. He also kind of reminds me of the guy from Resident Evil 8 who also uses scraps to turn into a monster. And while it is cool, that doesn't happen in the original at all, and it almost feels out of place and like they just put it here to make the fight feel more epic. Honestly, I'm not sure how to feel about it, but I did still enjoy my time with this fight. Next up, we have Abzu and Corneo. This boss really surprised me when I got to it because I did not expect to see the two of these guys in this game, especially Abzu. After playing this fight, I can almost guarantee we will see these two again in part 3. If I had to guess, I'd say probably in Wutai. This fight takes place in the Gold Saucer Coliseum and is one of the many fights you fight here, and my favorite one. Abs was already one of my favorite bosses in Remake, and I'm glad to see him return. This fight is also pretty challenging here, and I almost died while fighting, especially when he starts using his spin move and rams into you. That can be a bit hard to avoid. The music here is also another banger. I just love the music in this game. But my favorite part of this fight is after it's over and everybody's threatening Corneo again, just like in the remake. It's just perfect. In 12th place, we have Reno and Rude. This is my favorite Turks fight in the game, mostly because Reno is my favorite Turk. I was so glad to see him return, and especially team up with Rude again. And not only do I like the two of them together, I also like the party we get to play as here, which is the main three, Cloud, Tifa, and Barret. This fight was pretty tough though. These two guys don't mess around, especially Reno with his lightning attacks. I do like how in this fight these guys feel more like rivals now and less like enemies. Plus, fighting them in the Temple of the Ancient was a great addition to the fight. Overall, I really enjoyed this fight, especially more than the fight against Song and Elena. Next up, we have the Endurance Suppressor. This is a fight against the mech that Palmer is in. This takes place almost immediately after the fight with Dyne, and honestly, I prefer this one a little bit more. The design of the Endurance Suppressor is really cool looking, and it kind of reminds me of a frog with the way it jumps around. And this fight can also be tough unless you use a lot of lightning attacks. He's weak to lightning attacks, and they take him out pretty easy. One of my favorite things about this fight though is when Palmer gets out of his mech and starts taunting you. It's so funny. This guy is just such a goofy character, but I really like him. And again, we have another great song to go along with this fight. I really enjoyed going up against this boss, which is why I ranked it as high as I did. In 10th place, we have the Crimson Mare Mark II. This is similar to the Endurance Suppressor, but this time Scarlet's in control. This boss design is so cool looking, it almost reminds me of a Gundam kind of. The red also looks so good on it. I was so glad to finally beat up Scarlet in this game because I hate this lady, which makes sense because you're supposed to hate her. But this fight just gets me excited for the slap fight in part 3. I really hope we get something even better. The fight itself is pretty fun and one of the more tough fights in this game. The Crimson Mare will shoot you, and it also has two blades that it'll attack you with, doing some serious damage. This fight has you using Tifa, Yuffie, and Aerith, so it's essentially a girl fight, and I really like it. This boss also takes place in the same spot we fought the Specimen boss, which is the Gungaga reactor. Everything about this fight is just really solid, which is why I ranked it as high as I did. In 9th place, we have our first Jenova fight, Jenova Emergent. This is where we get into the really good bosses. Any fight against Jenova is so good. Plus, it has the most iconic theme, and I like all of the different versions of it. This one is actually one of my favorites. I like the part where the song kind of speeds up, and then the sections with all the, I guess, chanting? I'm not really sure what you would call that, but it's so cool. Just like all the other designs of Jenova, this one's also really good, especially the creepy skull face it has. Then you've got the cool second phase where it almost turns into like an animal type thing with the multiple hands and the weird purple eyes. It's gross but also really cool looking. I also really like how the setting changes whenever you fight Jenova. It becomes all Jenova-fied and really gross looking. It's almost like she morphed into the environment around her. The fight isn't as tough as the later Jenova fight, but it's still enjoyable, and honestly this fight carries this chapter for me. Next up, we have the Forgotten Experiment. This one is up this high kind of because of nostalgia. I remember fighting this boss in the original Final Fantasy VII, and it was one of those bosses that looked really weird, and I wondered how they were going to carry it over to this game. And they really did it justice. This boss has such a cool but kind of wacky design, and I really like it. This boss is also really fun to fight as well. You gotta pay attention to when it transforms because it changes its weakness and resistances. If you use the opposite of what it's resistant to and force it to transform multiple times, you'll pressure it. It's one of those fights where you really gotta think about how you go about things, and I really enjoy it here. I'm just really glad they kept this boss in the game and didn't cut it, because it's one I have a bunch of memory stuff from the original game. In 7th place, we have Ginatak. This is another good one I remember a lot from the original game, and I think here he's even better. First off, his design is super cool looking here. It's pretty similar to the original game, just with a huge upgrade. The fight is another tough one too. At certain points in the fight, he'll send out a bunch of the soul flames that you gotta fight off, and what's even better is he casts Doom on you, so you gotta do this quick. I love seeing status effects like Doom make a return to the series. It really adds to the high stakes of this boss. One of my favorite things about this fight though is the music. It's one of my favorite boss themes in this game, and it really fits this fight very well. Overall, this fight just does everything you'd want from a good boss fight, which makes it very enjoyable. In 6th place, we have the final fight against Sephiroth. This fight would have been higher if we hadn't already fought Sephiroth so many times throughout the remake trilogy so far. Honestly, I would have been fine with Sephiroth Reborn being the final fight, but this one still isn't bad. Here you control Aerith and Cloud, and this fight feels like a fight mostly between Aerith and Sephiroth, but Cloud just so happens to be there. Just like usual, Sephiroth has some strong moves he can use to really mess you up. Most of his attacks are fast sword combos, but he does have a notorious attack that will drop you and Aerith's HP to 1. If you can't heal fast, you'll be in trouble. As for the music of this fight, it's just another Sephiroth theme. But one of the coolest parts about this fight is the setting. It's so cool and almost has a spacey feel to it. At the end of the day though, it's just another Sephiroth fight, but there's nothing wrong with that, and it's still quite enjoyable. We're getting into the best of the best now, and in 5th place we have Demon Gate. This is a reoccurring boss in the Final Fantasy series, and one of my favorites in the original Final Fantasy VII. Here it's even better. Instead of there being one Demon Gate, there's now 2, one in each side of the room. This guy probably has my favorite boss design in the entire game. It's just so cool looking. The fight itself though is pretty easy, and honestly I'm fine with that. Just finally reaching this boss after making it through the very long Temple of the Ancients felt so good. This is another boss with a great theme as well, which is a reoccurring thing for bosses in this game, but here it's just the best. I don't think there's a single thing I dislike about this boss, it's just one of my favorites. In 4th place we have Sephiroth Reborn. This fight has a bunch of phases where you fight him as Cloud, then you fight him as Zack, then you fight him as the rest of your party. It kinda goes back and forth, it can be pretty long, which is my only real complaint with this fight is how long it takes. My favorite thing is how the fight resembles Bizarro Sephiroth from the original game. It looks almost exactly like that boss. Each of the phases of this fight are pretty fun though. I really like the start of this boss where you play as Cloud and you have to climb up Bizarro Sephiroth, or Sephiroth Reborn. The Whispers also kind of make an appearance here too, which a lot of people probably don't like, but honestly it doesn't bother me much. I also really like the Zack section as well, where you're in the destroyed church fighting this guy. The parts where you play as the rest of your party are actually pretty tough, especially since there Sephiroth Reborn has that one move that can bring everybody to 1 HP. I actually died there once and accidentally restarted the fight all the way back from Genova, I think. Yeah, that part was a little annoying. But this boss definitely feels like a Final Fantasy final boss with all the phases, and it's pretty good. In 3rd place we have the Red Dragon. This boss is awesome and I just loved it in the original. I also really like what they did with the arena here and how the gravity does something weird and it flips you upside down onto the ceiling. The arena you fight this guy in is just so cool. This boss isn't easy either. It has a variety of fire attacks, one where he blows lava on the ground and you gotta run away to avoid it. He also has a strong fire breathing attack that you can luckily avoid by hiding behind the 4 pillars in the room. Not only is this boss tough, it's also really cool looking. Other than the Turks, the Temple of the Ancients had some of my favorite boss designs, and this is one of them. As for the music, it's decent here, but it doesn't really stand out like some of the rest. But that's fine though, because the fun fight itself makes up for it. Overall, this is just a really solid fight. In 2nd place, we have the Galleon Beast. This boss fight is incredible. Vincent is already my favorite character, but when it becomes the Galleon Beast, he's even cooler. This fight also makes me wonder what it'll be like when we get to play as him in the 3rd part. Cause in the original, he could turn into this as well as more forms. I can't imagine being able to play as something this huge. Although I do feel like they may tone it down a bit. The Galleon Beast also just looks so cool. It kinda reminds me of Ifrit if Ifrit had Vincent's hair. This fight is also one of the more fun ones as well. Galleon Beast has a ton of attacks and he's very fast, so you gotta watch out and be careful. And the music is the best part of this fight. It's also my favorite theme in the entire game. It gives off a Bloodborne feel to it and I just love that. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, the Galleon Beast kinda looks like a Bloodborne boss as well a little bit. But overall, a near perfect fight that almost got put in the 1st place spot, but I just like one boss a bit more. But before we get to that number 1 boss fight, if you've made it this far, I want to thank you, and also be sure to subscribe. We're almost to 1,000. But let's go ahead and see what that number 1 boss fight is. In number 1, and my favorite boss in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, is Jenova Lifeclinger. This fight is so good. Honestly, if this was the final boss in the game, I would have been satisfied. This fight happens right after a certain someone gets killed, and the music starts playing. The music is so good. It starts off as Aerith's theme and slowly gets taken over by Jenova's theme, almost as if it's foreshadowing something. The fight itself has a couple of phases, and they are each super fun. The first one just has Jenova smacking you with her tentacles. Then the second phase, Jenova grows big wing looking things and is a bit more cinematic. Like when you're fighting it while falling, that's just so cool. And even though we're fighting Jenova for the second time, they did a great job at making this one stand out and not feel the same as the first one. Jenova is way more menacing looking here as well, especially in the first phase where you can see its ribcage and some bones. It's gross looking but still really cool. I just love how this fight evolves as you make your way through each of the phases. That's probably the best part. Overall, this boss fight is just so good, and not only is it my favorite Final Fantasy VII Rebirth boss, it might be one of my favorite Final Fantasy bosses in general. It's just that good. There you have every Final Fantasy VII Rebirth boss ranked. Do you agree with this list? Let me know in the comments what your favorite bosses in this game are, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out some of the other videos on the channel as well. I want to also thank you guys for watching. This was a tough video to put together, but that's all for now, and I'll see you guys in the next video.